Welcome to the Sound of Economics. I am Maria Demertzis and I am the Deputy Director at Bruegel, the Brussels-based economics think tank. In this episode of Director's Cut, we are actually continuing a discussion that we often have at Bruegel on what we would like to call shifting economic forces at the global arena. We have, on the one hand, the digital agenda, and that includes things like artificial intelligence, robots, but also the financial services, fintech, crypto assets. Countries have actually exploited these aspects very differently across the globe, and some of them have secured leading positions and other ones are lagging. At the same time, we have policies, or I should say maybe policy attitudes, that are becoming increasingly country-centric. Note the choice of my word here. The opposite of global, if you may say so. The US is becoming increasingly antagonistic with its main partners, including Europe, which is traditionally an ally, and certainly with China, which is big and increasingly getting bigger, and has world aspirations, but actually follows a rather different economic model to the way that it approaches its global involvement. With me today to discuss these issues, I have the pleasure of welcoming Stephanie Segal from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Stephanie, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be with you.
And from the other side of the Atlantic, we have our very own, the director of Bruegel, Guntram Wolff. Guntram, welcome.
Thank you, Maria.
Well, thank you both for joining us in this conversation. Stephanie, if I might possibly ask you to start, if you could take us through, or talk us through, if you like, why and how the US is changing its degree of openness and engagement, and primarily its willingness to engage at the global scene. Can you talk us through why and the how?
Sure. Well, I think, some of the themes that you've hit upon were ones that were certainly evident through our presidential campaign back in 2016. And I think the big kind of headline view is that the economy is not necessarily working for everyone and working for all Americans. So I think that that's a sense that that has been around, certainly not a function of just this past year, but it's been there for a while. I think the drivers behind that feeling, we can look at things like stagnant wages, a very kind of weak and slow recovery from the global financial crisis, and increasing income inequality. So I think the characteristics of the economy that have led to this feeling of the economy not working for everyone are there for all to see. I think what's different is the diagnosis as to why that's the case, and I think that's really something that was animated throughout the 2016 campaign, and that the Trump campaign and now President Trump really seized upon. And he, in his campaign in particular, pointed to the United States essentially being taken advantage of, that the rules of the game were rigged, and that the U.S. was not actually able to engage in what has now been come to know as free, fair, and reciprocal. So I think that's kind of the diagnosis, and then the response to that, I think, gets to what you have talked about. I like the term, the increasingly country-centric policies. So the real boogeymen in this have been trade, and we can get into some of the specifics of how that's played out, in the U.S. basically being taken advantage of in different trade agreements. And then China in particular has been kind of singled out as a culprit, whether we're talking about economic issues or some of the broader kind of geostrategic issues.
But is it the case that some of these domestic issues that, of course, are of relevance, you mentioned the inequality being an important driver, justifies a changing in behavior at the global level? Is there a link between the two? Is there a sort of a causality between one and the other that justifies a U.S. position that is actually different to what it was 10 or 15 years ago?
Well, I think maybe you're referring to inequality itself. I think has been characterized and I agree with the characterization as a global issue. So there are kind of the domestic factors that I was talking about, domestic policy choices about how you collect revenues and how you then redistribute those revenues. But I think the phenomenon of inequality is one that's a global issue, and I think we would need to look to what are potentially some of the global drivers. And you mentioned initially, Maria, the interest both in the kind of politics and attitudes, but also the digital agenda, which is a separate topic. But I think there are some factors kind of in the digital and technology space that also may explain some of the trends in global inequality.
Yeah. We're going to come back to some of these issues, certainly the trade issue and the global behavior. But Guntram, can I turn to you? How do we see these things in Europe? How do we sort of deal with a much more antagonistic U.S. when it comes to the relationship with Europe?
Well, I'd say Stephanie talked about the sluggish recovery in the United States and the fact that the U.S. economy doesn't work for everyone. I think from a European point of view, that sounds, of course, quite amazing, because the U.S. recovery post-financial crisis, global financial crisis, is always given as sort of the way to do it in Europe, because we did much worse than the U.S. in terms of our recovery, and we had a big double-dip recession, of course, in 2011. Now, I think from our point of view, from the EU point of view, there is indeed a big debate on the trade issues, but I think perhaps the newer debate is the one on technology leadership, and there again we look a lot towards the US. We look a lot at what the United States is doing in terms of protecting key technologies. Especially in the face of Chinese competition, and so I think this whole discussion that has gained a lot of ground in the U.S. on CFIUS, on export controls, is something that is being very closely looked at here at the European Union, and there is significant forces in Europe that I think would love to see the EU emulating or copying the US. Now, for a variety of reasons, that's not so easy to do. But I think it would be interesting to hear perhaps a bit more from Stephanie on CFIUS and the export control measures that are currently taken in the US, and how this is actually working, how our investments from China into the US being controlled because of security concerns, and you know how that plays into the broader picture. And then perhaps I can also talk a bit more about what the European Union is currently doing in that space, what kind of regulation is about to be passed on both export control as well as on investment control.
Stephanie.
Sure. No, I'd be happy to do that. I would put a period, or I guess a break here in the conversation, and distinguish between the some of the macro issues and inequality, right, and what I think of as economic insecurity. The issues we've been talking about on economic insecurity are separate and distinct from the issues that Guntram just mentioned, relating to the link between economics and national security. So I think those are two separate conversations that are both highly political and politicized right now. But on Guntram's questions, the history of screening foreign investment in the United States is actually a long one. We have something, you mentioned CSIS, stands for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's been around since the 1970s. It has been reformed in a few different periods of time. once in the 1980s related to, or I'd say motivated by a large influx of foreign investment, in part from some of the Gulf countries, also from Japan in the 1980s. It was reformed again in the wake of a Dubai ports investment, where this was post 9/11. In the 2000s, there was a series of ports that were being acquired by Dubai ports that actually went through the process, but there was quite a political backlash to that, resulting in a pretty significant reform to CSIS. And then the most recent episode of reform, which is what is currently in implementation right now, and you hear the sirens in Washington, D.C. I don't know if that's coming across right now,
is.
but sorry about that. So this most recent reform, what you referred to as FIRMA, is the Foreign Investment Review Modernization Act, and that was motivated, although it is not actually in the legislation itself. It syncs up very closely with the perceived threat stemming from foreign investment, mostly coming from China. And so that legislation started making its way through the process here in the United States, talked about starting in 2016, but really started to go through the process in 2017 and was passed into law in summer of 2018. So just this past year. And now we're in the implementation phase. So once it's been reformed, the actual implementation now will take around a year and a half to actually get all the regulations written and into place. But there were a few significant things that came out of the FIRMA reform, and key among them was the issue of technology that Guntram had mentioned, and the perception that that China was using the state to make foreign acquisitions, in particular to improve its technological capacity and its innovative capacity, and that it had a strategy to do so. So just even thinking in terms of a coherent strategy that was intended to give China the state, as opposed to independent actors in the Chinese economy, but to give the state an advantage. And then also the heightened awareness, I would say, that that came out in the course of the reform debate, that much of the threat to national security was coming not only from foreign investment in the United States, but from what was called outbound transfers. So it wasn't necessarily foreign capital coming into the U.S. to acquire a property, but it was the transfer of technologies, and sometimes the fact that those technology transfers were the basis of certain joint ventures between American and Chinese or other foreign businesses. And that was something that was, I think, identified really for the first time as a security, or conceived as a security threat in the FIRMA context through this, or in the CSIS context through this debate. And the way it was ultimately handled was to beef up the export controls, the export controls framework in the United States, to really focus on the potential national security threat from these technology transfers. And so the legislation that was actually passed had reform to CSIS, but then also an Export Control Reform Act. And the big piece of that, which is to identify national security threats posed from emerging and foundational technologies, that is what is now in the implementation phase in the United States. Yeah. And I think that's what so many foreign countries and so many countries that are also technological leaders and innovators are paying a lot of attention to.
We don't have the equivalent of CFIUS in Europe. We do worry about some of the things that Stephanie said. Certainly the technology transfer is an issue that's been discussed in Europe a lot. How do we see these things in Europe vis-a-vis China? What is it that we worry about China, and what is it that in Europe we think we ought to do to be able to stay in the game?
Well, I would say the reason why these two debates are actually connected, the first debate we have had and then the more specific one on technology, is that prior to the financial crisis, both the United States and the European Union felt quite comfortable about their economic and technological leadership position. Now, that changed quite dramatically during the financial crisis, in that both the United States and the European Union took a significant economic hit, which not only meant GDP was falling and GDP growth was subdued afterwards in the European Union at least, but it also meant that we really lost GDP level. So we lost income, and we lost relative to China even more dramatically, because as you may recall, during the financial crisis, China did enact a major investment initiative, and actually, instead of seeing its GDP contract in the two main years, 2008 and 9, the Chinese economy grew cumulatively by something like 18%. 18%. So the gap and the comfortable lead that, if I may say so, the West had vis-a-vis China sort of disappeared. And I think this has basically given rise to a lot of worry, of course, discontent in the population, feelings that the economy doesn't work anymore, feelings that Stephanie mentioned at the beginning, that the system is rigged, and that has been particularly pronounced in the US, that view. But of course, we also have some sort of a feeling of that sort in the European Union, perhaps less pronounced. So what is happening in this space in the European Union is that we have, I would say, a discussion on how to have our firms compete. What can be the factors that would improve the firm and the corporate leadership vis-a-vis China. Now, the reality is that among the top, let's say, 20 technology firms, there is no European firm, while there's, I think, 11 American and only nine Chinese ones. So we clearly feel in the technology space that our core companies are not top anymore in the European Union. And more broadly, also, if you look just at the general top 50 Fortune 500 companies, the European companies are falling behind. And so the debate is, well, is size the problem? Do we need to change our competition policy? That was very much the debate around the Siemens Alstom case. I personally think that issues of state aid control vis-a-vis China are significantly more important, and that is an issue that could be settled at the WTO. So could the WTO get more effective instruments in reining in state subsidies, including those of state-owned enterprises, which are currently not considered as state subsidies? So that's one debate, but also could we have our own instruments vis-a-vis Chinese investors that want to enter our markets with state subsidization? Now, then there is the whole debate on merger control, and Siemens Alstom is an example. Should we have bigger companies and take it easy on merger control, which I think is a very controversial debate. And then finally, there is the more direct security links, where I think the problem we have on this side of the pond compared to the US is that national security is not defined at the EU level, but national security is defined at the country-specific level, right? And so our so-called CFIUS regulation, which is basically now implemented and passed in the legislative process, basically makes it very clear that the definition of national security is in the responsibility of member states, but it establishes a process that would allow that would allow the European Commission to question investments when a third of the EU member states think there is a security concern, and it also requires member states to notify. So it is a step forward in sort of having an instrument that allows us to screen better the kind of investments that are happening in the European Union. But it's well away, far away from what the US is doing, and certainly much less intrusive and much less all-encompassing than the US CFIUS regulation, which and the export control regulation, which really covers a lot of sectors. So I think that's perhaps how I would sort of link the two debates and how this links to the US.
Well, can I go back? Guntram, you mentioned a number of different things, which of course are all interrelated. I'm always quite amazed how quickly we move from issues of economic security to issues of national security, and how interlinked the two have become. They always were, but in terms of the dialogue, the two are grossly interlinked. And we think about, autonomy, economic autonomy, as a way of, preserving our actually national security. These are issues that are very much on the fore these days. But I wanted to discuss, simply because I now have two views, one from the Atlantic, two different ways of seeing things, one from the Atlantic and one from Europe, about the methods. Because the method of addressing this issue is actually quite different. On the US side, there is a very clear preference for bilateral approaches. I have a problem, I go to the country I have the problem with, I talk to them directly. Europe is very different in this respect. Wouldn't you agree? We don't have the bilateral as much as the US. We prefer a multilateral system, a common denominator of laws that we could all possibly envisage to apply. And therefore, we try and achieve our objectives via a multilateral system. Now, how do you see these two evolving? A US style that is a lot more bilateral, and which, in your view, is more effective in terms of moving forward? Stephanie?
Yeah, I think I would actually push back a bit on the notion that that bilateral is synonymous with U.S. style. I would agree that it is the approach of the current administration, and there's a view that the size of the United States in particular gives it particular leverage that is beneficial in negotiations, and why surrender some of that leverage to a multilateral process, for instance, the WTO. So I think that is characteristic of the Trump administration. But I, being perhaps somewhat nostalgic, I think of the United States central role in just the creation of these multilateral institutions, and you do have this debate and ongoing discussion in the United States, many people that do view these institutions as in the United States' interests, and that promoting a rules-based global order is something that, yes, serves the United States well, also global economy well, and that is in the United States' best interest. So I would characterize it that way, but I don't think there's any doubt that in the current administration there has been a preference to engage bilaterally. The most, I think, pronounced example, or the clearest example, was just the decision initially to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I shouldn't say withdraw, but it hadn't actually been in effect when the current administration came into office. But that was one of the first moves, was to take the United States out of that process, and in turn now to launch different bilateral trade negotiations, including one that is soon to kick off with Japan, instead of coming back into TPP.
Can I ask you something, Stephanie, on this specific issue? Because Guntram mentioned in one of the things he said that actually the shares of relative GDP have actually shifted dramatically after the financial crisis, and actually the China is almost as big in GDP terms as the US and the EU, if not bigger. And you mentioned the issue of size, the ability to exert leadership and affect power comes with size, and the US has enjoyed that for a very long time. where does this leave us? The Chinese business model, if I may call it that way, is somewhat different to the business model that the US is following and that the EU, as a traditional ally of the US, has followed. Where are we going on this ability to sort of trade with each other, negotiate with each other? Are we going to establish a common rule-based system in which we can all comply with? Or size is going to take over, which of course means the Chinese way of doing business is going to become more predominant.
Yeah, well, I think that's precisely the point. I think that's exactly one of the strongest arguments in favor of taking a more multilateral approach, because the United States continues to be the largest single economy, but as you mentioned, depending on which measure you're looking at, if you look at economy based on purchasing power parity, China is already larger than the United States, and there's no question that that countries that are further down on the development scale right now are, as they should, trying to put in place policies that allow them to move up that scale and increase their relative weight in the global economy. I think, as I mentioned before, there are plenty in the United States that kind of recognize that fact, which goes then in the direction of wanting rules that are not subject to a single economic player dictating to others, but actually what are the rules that work for the system and work for any player. And I think, Europe is interesting, as you said, because as Guntram mentioned, there are certain authorities that are held at the member state level, but the EU is, an equal economic actor to the United States or to China, and I think that's why so much of the policy debate in thinking of what the system should look like is really it's a discussion among the largest economic players. So between the United States, China, the EU, and I would say Japan is also playing a big role here as well. So, but I think this is really kind of the essential question of whether all of our countries are better off in this kind of the bilateral world, as you said, where it's the bigger one kind of gets her way, or is it one that you want a rules-based system that everybody can play to the same set of rules? And that's why this debate right now is so critical.
Indeed. In fact, Guntram, the EU has been very consistent in that last point, right? We've always been advocates of multilateralism, and we like multilateral institutions. We like to play by the rules and then ensure that we also have an equal share in an ability to move discussions. The EU shares actually some of the views of the worries that the US has when it comes to some of the Chinese practices, and has indeed taken China to WTO courts about some of its practices. The promise of China when it entered the WTO in 2001 was to try and abide by some of the rules of the US and the EU, as the two biggest players in the system have formulated. But as we've seen and continue to see, in that respect, China has disappointed, right? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the EU is indeed a champion of multilateralism, but I do think that, in a sense, the multilateral system used to be very much supported by the hegemon, meaning by the United States, and as the relative weight of the United States is in decline, as, by the way, is also the relative weight of the European Union, the central question becomes who's supporting the system, right? And who will uphold the values and the explicit as well as implicit agreements that form the basis of the WTO. And indeed, the question is whether China will become more cooperative or less cooperative in supporting the overall system. I think there's no doubt to my question that China has hugely benefited from the WTO, as it should have. It is absolutely fundamental for the Chinese economic development. It was absolutely fundamental for the Chinese economic development to have been entering the WTO and entering the global trade game. entering also the global game to really acquire top technologies and so on and so forth. So China has hugely benefited. But I think, Maria, as you said, there are a number of concerns on Chinese practices, be it forced technology transfer, be it state-owned enterprises, be it the rule of law, that I think undermine and undermine the ability and the willingness of the United States and many other countries to continue playing fully by the rules in the WTO. And so I think this is at the heart of the conflict that we are seeing. And I can only say that we all should really be working together on preserving the multilateral system, because if we do not preserve it, we will end in a world that will be based purely on power relations, where the commonly shared rules are missing, and at that stage, it becomes actually a very tough world, where the EU is a big power, but as a sort of political power, it's not quite as big as the United States or China, for that matter, and so it would be quite bad for the EU, but also for the US and also for China. So ultimately, each of us, I think, have an interest in preserving and reforming the WTO, and my hope would be that this is the direction we are going.
I think, Stephanie, you agree with Guntram of the importance of the multilateral system. But if you were to, am I right?
You are right, and actually, if I could go back to what you had initially kind of talking about, the digital agenda, I think it takes even greater importance, because we're now kind of grappling with, what are the drivers of modern innovative economies, and clearly it's on the digital and technology side, where the rules and even kind of what are the policy issues that require rules are very much in flux right now. So I agree wholeheartedly with what Guntram said, and would actually underscore that it takes on even greater weight right now, given what are the key economic drivers.
We are slowly coming into an end, but can I ask both of you, if you were to change one thing in this direction, as in preserving the multilateral system, what would that be?
One thing only. Let's see. I mean, we've written a bit about this here at CSIS. I think it's very much consistent with Guntram's last comments about taking multilateral approaches to these issues. And I think there are some instances where the United States and this administration has done that. And so I think we need to work multilaterally and to treat our allies consistently as allies.
Guntram, one thing?
Yeah, I mean, I would somewhat paradoxically say that the building up of strong unilateral instruments that can be used as threats might in the end be helpful in preserving the multilateral system, because the more leverage you have in international negotiations, the more you can actually achieve a desirable outcome. So I actually do think that some of the bilateral things that we are doing here in the EU, including the building up of capacities such as CFIUS, will actually overall be helpful in preserving the multilateral system.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much both for joining us.